So my name is Maud Devolder. My project is conceptualizing processes of monumental architectural creation in the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age. It's a project I obtained in Université Louvain, but I will be moving to Ghent. On it, I will only spend 2 slides explaining what my project is about, and then I will orient the presentation on specific aspects I had to take into account when I prepared the project, and also some questions that had been asked before in the NCP. So, okay, the project stems from the fact that most human societies produce monumental buildings, and these monumental buildings, they require countless builders and vast amounts of material resources. And the current paradigm is that only centralized hierarchical socio-political systems have the ability to mobilize and to organize these resources. And this paradigm is especially pervasive in the study of the Bronze Age Aegean and Cyprus, so mainland Greece, Crete, the Cyclades, Western Turkey, and Cyprus, because there is a marked lack of explicit written sources for these regions in the 2nd millennium BC. And so their socio-political organization is very often undefined. But their monuments, which we call palaces, administrative or elite buildings, they are still systematically taken as the proof for the existence of powerful rulers, kings, or monarchs. The objective of my project is to challenge the systematic association between power and monumental architecture. Instead of presuming that powerful rulers are necessary for monumental construction, it considers that monuments may as well be built by groups that cooperated within a non-hierarchical setting. This new direction marks a paradigm shift from ongoing research in ancient architecture and history in general, for which I will bridge the knowledge gap between architectural remains on one side and the socio-political context of their construction. So my project is organized into 3 parts. First, data processing, second, analysis, and then modelization or conceptualization. So the data processing will focus on 40 monuments, which are based on 35 sites. And for each building, I will process specific architectural features, and these architectural features, I have defined them based on my own experience, my previous research, my field experience. So it's something I already knew very well. My project, and that was an important aspect when I had to formulate it, is that it is based only on literature review. There is no field work, except for a few sites, but generally no field work that is implied, because when I had to create the project, I was considering the fact that if you work on 40 monuments on 35 sites, you have to apply for permits for the 35 of them. You have to have the agreements of the director of each site. And generally, the director of each site will want part of the budget for his project as well, because of course, he's producing data. So I insisted on the fact that this project is based only on literature review. Of course, I had to justify in the project how it would be feasible in the framework of my ERC to produce interesting data based only on literature review. So I oriented that in like an innovative way by saying that all these data, they are already gathered, they are present. What I want to do is to offer a new perspective on them and to look in the literature review what specific aspects I have to search for in order to process architectural data. The question of the sample size, whatever the field you're in, is very important. I was very puzzled when I prepared my ERC because I knew of someone doing a work which is broadly similar to what I do, and we did an ERC project on one site only. So I was wondering, should I focus on a smaller number of sites and focus really on the collection of data? But I was advised that the project is not about data collection. So I decided to broaden the sample and focus instead on data processing. The second part of the project is the analysis of the results of the data processing. So the analysis is based on 8 parameters that will make it possible for me to define specific building management strategies for the construction of each project. Why did I define these 8 parameters? Because when I submitted my ERC project, so I got it after the second submission, I took into account a comment on the first submission, which was the translation of the collected data into the general outline of the proposal remains rather unclear and unspecified. So they told me that there was a methodological problem into going from data processing to conceptualization. So that was a major difference between the first time I applied and the second time I applied. I took like 6 weeks for the second application to really look into architectural remains and the way people process them, to try to define parameters to bridge this gap between material data and building management strategies. So the articulation between the material evidence and the higher meaning was very important. And it's something that I think this additional work made it so that I was granted the ERC Consolidator the second time. So as far as the conceptualization part is concerned, it's the part of the project that want to relate the building management strategies that were identified in the analysis with a certain form of socio-political organization. This is the most explorative part of the project. It's really the modelization and the conceptualization for which there will be an input from a researcher with a background in cultural anthropology. I would say that the data processing and analysis are two parts of the project where I really had to insist on the feasibility, while the conceptualization part was more connected to the high risk, high gain, because it's a question apparently that comes often, what's the difference between the two? So this conceptualization, the modelization, is the high risk, high gain part of my project. As far as questions concerning the organization of the work towards application is concerned, I started following events organized by the NCP and the Université Louvain already in 2016, 2017, to have an idea, to try to formulate a project, to see what could be interesting and discuss with people. I planned the first submission in 2018, but I felt I was not ready and decided to apply in 2019. I was evaluated B in step 1, so I had to wait 1 year before I could reapply. Okay, I was glad in a sense that I did not submit in 2018, because of course, if you're not ready and you were evaluated C, you have to wait 2 years. But a question that often comes is, how early should I apply? I think it's good, considering the present situation in academia, that you start preparing an ERC as soon as possible, because it plays a huge role into getting a permanent position. So as soon as you start, the sooner you start, the better it is. So as I said before, when I applied again in 2021, I worked on the main comments that had been made on the first application. So I really did additional research to define analytical parameters and really answer the main critique about the gap between material culture and the socio-political context of monumental construction. I used a lot, so for those who apply to FWO, FNRS, it's very useful to take the reports from the reviewers, from the experts who evaluate your application, because they are able to see what's wrong in your profile, if you have a similar project, what's wrong in your project, and they also pinpoint sometimes positive aspects of your profile on which you can work and use when you make the ERC application. There is a very important comment I want to make about the preparation of the application and the B1 and the B2. Everybody will tell you start with the B2. And of course, it's the largest part, it's the core of your project. But really be careful to devote enough time to the B1. Many people don't leave enough time. It was the case for me in the first time I applied. The B1 really, it must attract them, it must convince them about the high risk, high gain part of your project. So you really, really have to devote time to make that catchy, interesting, and to the point, not neglected because of the lack of time. So how is this B1 and different from the B2? I had the feeling, because I rechecked to try to see how it was different for me, the focus in B1 is more on the high gain. I really there highlighted the conceptual novelty of the proposal in response, in my case, not only to major scientific questions, but also societal challenge. I explained why it was important to study monumental architecture in the second millennium BC to understand better, the way we consider that there is no alternative except powerful people being in charge of everything. So really, I insisted a lot on the theoretical goal. It was very useful for me to define this conceptual novelty, to have a lot of time, like an incubation period where I read not only on my field, but also politics and different things to formulate the importance of the societal challenge. What was really useful also were the exchanges with support officers in the university, and also live or online courses that are offered. Okay, it's generally consulting company, but through the universities, you can have access to this online course, and that's pretty useful for defining how to formulate your B1. A question that was told to me that is often asked is, how did my project relate to my previous research? In my case, my own experience on the field and in research made it so that I was very familiar with the data. So the formulation of the data processing was very easy. And I could also very easily identify the knowledge gaps and the potential for new perspective on the architectural record. But the scope of the research, theoretically, was well beyond my previous research. Something I was advised to do in the application was to present my previous work in the field as preliminary findings, and stressing the substantial, conceptual, not methodological, conceptual leap forward. So in my case, I had made some studies that were hinting at the fact that the building project were not very homogeneous, that there was something different than what we generally conceived, but I did not insist on that too much. I just said, it's a preliminary finding, and I really want to look more into it. A question that is asked is, does the fact that I have not a permanent position play a role when I apply? It has a huge impact on your budget. So here I show you a graph with the estimation of the budget as submitted. And in dark green, it was the percentage, so 27% of the total budget that was devoted to my own wage, considering that I would be only hired 80% of the time. So yes, it does have an impact on your project because it has an immediate impact on your budget. Be careful that when you apply with a host institution, sometimes they require that you don't work for the project more than a certain amount of time. In my case, it was 80%. But if they don't offer you a job after, you will be only paid 80% of the time. So it's something you perhaps have to negotiate after. An advantage of already having a permanent position is that it's easier for you to find solutions for administrative support in the university. So, okay, there is, I won't say it's unfair, but you have disadvantage when you apply without a permanent position. But I saw absolutely no impact of me not having a permanent position in the interview and in the report of the submitted project. So the panel members, they really seemed not to take that into account. They did not care that I didn't have a permanent position. The fact that I didn't have a permanent position made it possible for me to travel a lot. I had postdocs in different countries, and this was very positively evaluated. So don't refrain from applying because you don't have a permanent position. The panel member won't be bothered by that. So a huge aspect of the application is to take into account the feasibility. In my case, I addressed the feasibility in a special box in the B1, and also in a more developed manner in the B2. So here I've put you an example, a summary of what I've put in the box. So I stated the project high conceptual risk. I explained what it was. And I also explained what action was taken to mitigate this risk at the theoretical, analytic, and operational levels. So in my case, at the theoretical level, I explained that the project's provocative claim is supported by cross-cultural, economic, and archaeoanthropological studies. So I was not taking the idea out of my pocket. There were bibliographic references that was showing that it was a good subject to explore. At the analytical level, I explained that the project's methodological framework had been devised to articulate the architectural evidence with nuanced forms of sociopolitical organization, so that I had addressed the main critique of the first submission. And then at the operational level, I explained that the sample of archaeological sites was sufficiently large, chronologically and geographically, that there was specialized expertise in the project, my experience, the experience that would be brought by postdoctoral researchers. And in my case, I also include an expert advisory board. And a third remark I did for the operational mitigation was that the project was structured along articulated work packages that followed a bottom-up approach. I also mentioned at the end, should the project not fulfill its goal entirely, there will be this and this and this and that aspect that are important for my field. What I also did, and it was based on the advice of a previous grant holder, is that at the end of each work package in the B2, I devoted a small part on risks and mitigation. So each of the WPs was divided into objectives, implementation, and risk and mitigation. Do I need help for making a successful application? So there are lots of people using training and consulting services. It's very expensive, but if you can get help from your university and the FNRS, that was the case for me, to use these services, just go for it. If you go for a single review, be careful that it is early enough and you can make the best of it. The first time I applied, the consultant read my application. I think I got his answer 10 days before the final submission. So it was pointless. Book early enough because they get lots of applicants to review. It was especially the case when I applied, but I think it's a general issue. Even if consulting companies don't read your application because it's too expensive, for example, try to at least follow the live or online courses that they offer. It's very, very useful for me in the Consolidator Grant to do the jump from, let's say, for me, data processing to make conceptual leap. The online course or the live course that they offer are very useful for that. The consulting company, in my case, were very useful for defining the framework of the B1 and making it distinct from B2 and attractive. Just one thing, be very careful about the vocabulary that you use. So very often you will see that the consultants tell you that you have to use risky, bold, pioneering. And I remember the first time I read their comments, I thought that the application sounded very arrogant, and I decided to remove all this vocabulary. And it's a comment that a panel member and someone who's used reviewing such project also told me that it's sometimes, at least for my panel, it was not very much appreciated to sound too arrogant. Try to get help from researchers in your institution. In Université Louvain, it was fantastic because there was an advisor who was able to exchange ideas with me very early, just discuss. So I was not losing the time of making a very advanced draft and then realizing that I was going into the wrong direction. So really try to use the support officers in the university as much as you can. There is a lot of, and this is what I've put in the blue panel, the consultants especially, they insist sometimes, try to see who is in your panel by calculating who was in the previous panel or the panel 2 years before. And it's very useful for the interview because in the interview, you realize that you will be confronted to people who are not in your very, very, very specific field. So I have to discuss to convince that your project is important also for people working slightly outside of your field of specialization. But what I've noticed, both in the written report and in the interview, is that there is a balance. It's not because one of the panel members hates your project or believes that humanities should use more hard science that your project is going to be rejected. There is a discussion between them. So don't refrain from applying because you realize that your worst enemy is in the panel. It's sometimes something people say, but to me it seemed that there was really a balance into the advice of between the advice of the different panel members. So just a few random tips stemming from questions that were sent to the NCP. Apply early enough, and remember that getting to the interview might already help you finding a position. Consider working on shaping your CV in specific directions that might help your application. Prioritize some projects and some publications. I've seen in the previous presentation that you need at least one paper or some publications. To me, it seemed that they were very demanding in terms of about the profile of the researcher. In my case, my PhD was 11 years old, so it was kind of normal. I should have published a lot, but I had the feeling that they were pretty demanding on that. Do not compare your project and CV to other applicants, but try to think of the balance between your profile and your project. I had told you before I didn't have a permanent position, but it made it possible for me to travel, do a lot of field work, and that was very useful for the project. So it's always a balance between you and what you want to do. I think it was important to relate my research to broader societal challenges. I don't know if it's applicable to every field, but I thought it resonated well with the interests of the panel in the interview. Of Science and Knowledge, and oh yes, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity. I was surprised that in my case, so it is an interdisciplinary project, but one of the main questions they asked in the interview what was the scientific output of my specialization, of my project for other disciplines. So it was not only what I was integrating from outside into my project, but also the other way around. So